The first thing she knew was wood. Rough, splintered wood pressing against her cheek, smelling of pine sap and dust. The second was darkness, a thick, suffocating black that was absolute. Then came the motion of violent, rhythmic jolting that rattled her teeth and sent waves of nausea through her stomach. Clara's eyes flew open to nothing. She tried to lift a hand to her head, but her arms wouldn't move. A thick, coarse rope bit into her wrists, binding them tight behind her back. Panic, cold and sharp as a winter icicle, pierced through the fog in her mind. She tried to scream, but the sound was choked off by a strip of filthy cloth tied so tightly across her mouth it scraped her lips raw. The gag tasted of sweat and fear. She was in a box, a crate, being moved. The memories came back in jagged shards. A dusty road, the kind smile of a man offering a ride on his wagon. A sudden, brutal shove from behind, the suffocating weight of a burlap sack over her head. The last thing she remembered was the splintering pain in her skull as something hard struck her. And then, only this rocking darkness. Outside the wooden walls of her prison, she could hear the groan of wheels turning on a dry, rutted path, the snort and stamp of horses, and the low murmur of men's voices. She strained to listen, forcing her panic down, turning it into a single, focused point of attention. "Should be there by sundown if we push 'em," a gravelly voice said. It was deep and lazy, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "Jeb, you said that yesterday," another voice, higher and meaner, whined back. "This heat's cooking my brain. Why'd we have to take the long way around?" "Because, Silas, the short way goes right past Sheriff Miller's territory, and I ain't keen on dancing at the end of his rope for a bit of enterprise," the one called Jeb answered. "Now shut your trap. The less you talk, the sooner we get there." A third voice, younger and more hesitant, chimed in. What if she don't wake up? That was a hard knock you gave her." "She'll wake up, Billy," Jeb said with a chilling finality. "They always do. And the buyer at the fort don't pay for damaged goods. So you best hope she does." The fort, a buyer, goods. The words slammed into Clara with the force of a physical blow. They weren't taking her somewhere. They were delivering her, like a sack of grain or a side of beef. A wave of sickness washed over her, so profound she thought she might choke. Her mind reeled, trying to grasp the reality of it. Sold. She was going to be sold. She pressed her face against a crack between the planks, desperate for a glimpse of the world she was being stolen from. A sliver of blinding, white-hot light burned her eye. She could see a vast, empty expanse of pale brown earth and scorched grass stretching to a hazy horizon under a bleached blue sky. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the land. There were no trees, no houses, no sign of life anywhere. Just the endless, empty west. The heat in the crate was already stifling, baking the air until it was a thick, unbreathable soup. Sweat trickled down her temples and stung her eyes. Thirst was a claw scraping at the back of her throat. A soft sound from the corner of the crate startled her. It wasn't a rat or the shifting of cargo. It was a whimper, a human sound, thin and full of despair. She wasn't alone. Clara twisted her body, the rough wood scraping her back. In the oppressive blackness, she could just make out another form huddled against the far wall. A girl, smaller than herself, her knees drawn up to her chest. She was weeping silently, her shoulders shaking with each sob. The sight of the other girl's terror did something strange to Clara. It didn't lessen her own fear, but it forged it into something harder, something like anger. They could take her. They could bind her and gag her and haul her across this God-forsaken wasteland like an animal. But she would not let them break her, not while she could still draw breath. Her mind raced, cataloging her options. They were non-existent. She was bound, locked in a box, guarded by at least 3 men. To struggle now would be suicide. She had to wait for a mistake, an opportunity, no matter how small. And then she remembered. It was a foolish, small thing, a secret she'd kept since she was a girl. Her father, a blacksmith, had always told her that a person should never be without a tool. One day, while helping him mend a fence, a short piece of binding wire, no longer than her little finger, had snapped off and fallen into the dirt. On a whim, she had picked it up. It was thin but strong, with a sharp, angled break at one end. She had polished it on her sleeve and, for reasons she couldn't explain, slipped it deep into the seam of her sturdy leather boot, right where the sole met the upper. It had been there for months, a forgotten trinket. Until now. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing, but it flared in her chest like a struck match. The wire, if she could get to it, she might be able to work on the ropes. The challenge seemed insurmountable. Her hands were bound tight behind her. Her legs were cramped and stiff. The other girl was just a few feet away. Any sudden movement, any sound, could alert the men outside. She took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to quiet the frantic beating of her heart. She had to do this. First, she needed to get her hands down from the small of her back. She pressed her feet against the wall of the crate and pushed, arching her spine. Pain, sharp and searing, shot through her shoulders. The muscles screamed in protest. The ropes were so tight they felt like they were cutting through to the bone. She gritted her teeth against the gag, tasting her own blood where she'd bitten her lip. Inch by agonizing inch, she worked her bound wrists downward, over the curve of her hips. Her knuckles scraped raw against the rough-sawn planks. Splinters dug into her skin. She paused, gasping for air, listening. The wagon creaked. The men's voices were a low drone, arguing about a card game they hadn't heard. Now, for the hardest part, she needed to reach her boot. She bent her knees, trying to bring her right foot up toward her hands. It was an unnatural, contorted position. A cramp seized her thigh, a knot of pure fire. She stifled a cry, her body trembling with the effort. The other girl let out another soft sob, oblivious. "Come on, Clara," she told herself, her father's voice echoing in her memory. "A tool is only as good as the hand that wields it." She pushed through the pain, her whole body slick with sweat, her fingers, numb and clumsy from the lack of circulation, fumbled against the worn leather of her boot. She couldn't feel anything. Despair began to creep back in, a cold shadow at the edge of her newfound hope. Was it even still there? Had it fallen out during the struggle? She tried again, forcing her fingertips to work, to remember the shape of the seam. She traced the line of stitching, her breath held tight in her chest. And then she felt it, a tiny, hard lump beneath the leather. It was there. Relief washed over her, so powerful it almost made her weak. But she couldn't stop now. Using her thumbnail, she picked and scraped at the thick stitches of the seam. The thread was old and tough. It took minutes that felt like hours, her nail bending and tearing, her fingers screaming with the strain. Finally, with a small pop, a single stitch gave way. With renewed urgency, she worked her finger into the tiny opening, pushing and wiggling until she could hook the edge of the wire. It was slow, frustrating work. The wire was wedged in tight. She had to pull it out without letting it slip from her numb grasp and fall into the straw-covered floor of the crate, where it would be lost forever. Her shoulder felt like it was being torn from its socket. Her vision began to tunnel. The darkness of the crate edged with shimmering spots of light. Just a little more. She felt the wire begin to slide free, cold, thin metal against her skin. She hooked it with 2 fingers, her whole body tensed for the final pull. With a last, desperate tug, it came loose. It was in her hand. Clara slumped against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion and pain. But her mind was fiercely, brilliantly clear. She curled her fingers around the small piece of metal, its sharp end pressing into her palm. It was a tiny thing, almost insignificant, a piece of forgotten scrap. But in the suffocating darkness of the crate, it felt as heavy and as powerful as a blacksmith's hammer. It was a tool. It was a chance. The wagon hit a deep rut, throwing her against the other girl, who let out a startled gasp. "Shh," Clara managed, the sound muffled and distorted by the gag. She couldn't see the girl's face, but she felt her tremble. "Outside," Silas's voice cut through the air. "What was that?" The wagon slowed. The rhythmic creaking of the wheels stopped. Heavy footsteps crunched on the dirt outside their crate. "Just the cargo shifting," Jebediah grunted dismissively. "Get moving, we're burning daylight." The footsteps retreated, and the wagon lurched forward again, resuming its monotonous, jolting rhythm. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She clutched the wire tighter, its sharp point a promise against her skin. The sun beat down. The crate grew hotter, and the endless miles of empty country rolled by. But for the first time since waking up in this nightmare, the terror was no longer absolute. It was now joined by a single, cold, and razor-sharp thought. They thought she was cargo. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting angle of the light that pierced the cracks in the crate. The heat settled in deep, a dry, baking oppression that stole the moisture from their bodies and the clarity from their thoughts. Clara held the wire in her palm, the metal a warm, secret weight. Her hands, still bound behind her, ached with a deep, throbbing pain. There had been no chance to use it, no moment of privacy or distraction. Beside her, the other girl, whose name she now knew was June, had fallen into a fitful, whimpering sleep. Then the world stopped. The jarring rhythm of the wagon ceased, and a profound silence fell, broken only by the buzzing of a lone fly that had found its way into their prison. The sudden stillness was more terrifying than the motion had been. It meant they had arrived. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear the men dismounting, their boots crunching on gravel. Their voices were low and tense. "You check on 'em. Silas," Jebediah ordered. "Make sure they're presentable. Colonel Abernathy is a particular man." "Why's it always me?" Silas whined, his voice sharp with irritation. "I swear, I've had my fill of this dust for one day." "Because you got a mean streak that makes you thorough," Jeb retorted, "without a hint of humor, and Billy's too soft-hearted. Now get to it. We get our gold and we're gone from this wretched place before morning." Heavy footsteps approached the wagon. A bolt scraped back, loud and final. With a groan of tortured wood, the top of the crate was torn away. Light flooded in, a sudden, brutal explosion of it that made Clara squeeze her eyes shut. She was blind and exposed. When she dared to open them again, 3 figures loomed over her, dark silhouettes against the searing white sky of late afternoon. Jebediah was a broad, bearded man with eyes like chips of slate. Young Billy hovered behind him, his face pale and nervous, and Silas, lean and wiry with a cruel twist to his thin lips, was already swinging a leg over the side of the wagon bed. He landed with a thud that shook the floorboards, and the stench of stale whiskey and sweat filled the confined space. June gasped and scrambled back into the corner, trying to make herself smaller. Silas ignored her, his eyes small and predatory, fixed on Clara. He saw the defiance in her posture, the way she held her chin up despite the filth and fear. It seemed to amuse him. "Well now," he drawled, crouching down so his face was level with hers. "Look what we have here, a little sparrow with the eyes of a hawk." He reached out and grabbed her chin, his fingers digging into her skin. He tilted her head from side to side, inspecting her as one would a horse. His gaze was cold, appraising, utterly devoid of humanity. Clara stared back at him, her body rigid, every muscle screaming at her to fight, to recoil, but she forced herself to remain still. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. The wire pressed into her palm, a secret promise of pain. "Teeth look good," he muttered, more to Jebediah than to her. He pried her lips apart with a dirty thumb, and she tasted the grime from his skin. Revulsion, hot and acidic, rose in her throat. He let her go abruptly and ran a hand down her arm, his calloused fingers snagging on the worn fabric of her dress. No obvious marks. You'll fetch a fine price. His touch was not seeking pleasure. It was the touch of a merchant assessing goods, a butcher checking a cut of meat. It was a violation so profound it left her feeling hollowed out, as if her very soul was being scraped away. His hands moved to her shoulder, then began to trace the line of her collarbone, his fingers inching toward the top buttons of her bodice. This was it, the line! A voice, raspy and cracked from thirst and disuse, broke the suffocating tension. Wait. The word was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a shard of glass. Silas froze. His hand stopped. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing in surprise, as if a piece of furniture had just spoken to him. Clara swallowed. The sound loud in the silence. She gathered what little strength she had left. We'll do it ourselves. Her voice was stronger this time, imbued with a cold resolve that came from the deepest, most untouched part of her. A long moment passed. The fly buzzed. Billy shifted his feet nervously on the ground outside. Jebediah watched, his face an unreadable mask. Silas slowly straightened up, a humorless smile spreading across his face. It was a contemptuous, knowing smirk that made Clara's skin crawl. He let out a short, ugly laugh. You think this is for my benefit? He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. You think I want to bother with the likes of you? He took a step back, gesturing around the dusty, sun-bleached landscape as if presenting a stage. This ain't for me, girly. It's for the client. The word struck Clara with a force that was almost physical. It wasn't just about being sold. It was about being prepared for sale. Displayed, presented. The last vestiges of her identity as a person were being systematically stripped away. She was an object, and an object had to be polished before it could be put on the shelf. The horror of it was so complete, so absolute, that it pushed past fear and settled in her gut as a block of ice. She looked past Silas, up at Jebediah, the man in charge, but her gaze landed on Silas again, and she held it. She did not cry. She did not beg or plead. The hawk he'd seen in her eyes was still there, unwavering and fierce. She simply watched him, her expression a blank canvas onto which he could project whatever he wanted. In the silent space between them, a bargain was struck. She was offering him the path of least resistance in exchange for the smallest shred of dignity, the right to undress her own body, to perform the final act of her own humiliation. It was a pathetic scrap of control, but it was everything. Perhaps he was unnerved by her stillness. Perhaps he was simply lazy and eager to get the job done. With a sigh of annoyance, he pulled a grimy knife from his belt. He lunged forward, and for a terrifying second, Clara thought he was going to cut her throat. Instead, he roughly sawed through the ropes binding June's gag. Then Clara's, the filthy cloth fell away, and she gasped in a lungful of hot, dusty air that felt cleaner than anything she had ever breathed. He then cut the ropes at their ankles. Hands stay tied, he grunted, severing the rope that bound their wrists together but leaving each girl's hands still bound in front of them. It was a small mercy, but a critical one. He tossed a small, near-empty canteen onto the floor of the wagon. The water sloshed weakly inside. Next to it, he threw 2 pieces of rough, gray cloth. Colonel Abernathy likes his acquisitions clean, as clean as you can get. Anyway, he said, his tone bored and dismissive. He gestured toward their clothes. Get those off. Both of you. You've got 5 minutes before I come back to collect you. Without another word, he turned and hoisted himself out of the wagon, leaving them alone in the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. Clara didn't move for a long moment. Silas's words echoed in her mind. It's for the client. She felt June's eyes on her, wide with terror and a dawning, desperate hope. The younger girl was looking at her as if she held all the answers. Slowly, painfully. Clara pushed herself into a sitting position. Her muscles screamed, and her head swam from dehydration and the sudden rush of movement. She picked up the canteen. Her hands, still bound at the wrists, were clumsy, but she managed to unscrew the cap. She took a small sip of the lukewarm, metallic-tasting water before passing it to June, who drank greedily. What are we going to do?" June whispered, her voice trembling. Clara looked down at her own hands, bound in front of her now. She could feel the wire, still safely clenched in her fist. An opportunity, a terrible, slim, desperate opportunity. She met June's terrified gaze. Her own face felt like a mask of dried mud and grime, but her eyes were clear and hard. She wasn't just a piece of cargo waiting for a buyer. She was a woman with a piece of sharpened wire, and she had just bought herself 5 minutes. "First," Clara said, her voice a low, steady rasp that held no room for fear. "We do what he says. We buy ourselves another minute." Night fell not as a blanket, but as a predator. It swallowed the last bruised streaks of purple and orange from the horizon and left behind a cold, profound blackness dotted with the indifferent glitter of a million stars. The oppressive heat of the day bled away into the dry earth, replaced by a chill that seeped through the thin walls of the small, windowless shed where they had been thrown. It was a storage room of some kind, smelling of old leather, dust, and the lingering scent of cured meat. They had been given a single bucket of water and a hunk of dry bread before being locked inside, their hands still bound in front of them with fresh rope, a cruel reminder of their status as property awaiting transfer. June had cried herself into a restless sleep, huddled in the corner on a pile of discarded burlap sacks. Clara sat perfectly still, her back pressed against the rough plank wall, and listened. For hours, she had done nothing but listen. At first, there had been the low murmur of voices from the main cabin, punctuated by the occasional rough laugh. She heard the clink of a bottle against a tin cup. Then the voices grew louder, more boastful. Jebediah's rumbling bass, Silas's mean-spirited cackle, and Billy's nervous, infrequent contributions. They were drinking, celebrating their payday before it had even arrived. This was what Clara had been waiting for. She tracked the passage of time by the sounds. The laughter grew sloppy. An argument flared up over a hand of cards, then died down in a drunken mumble. A chair scraped loudly against the floor, followed by the heavy thud of a man stumbling. Then, one by one, the sounds began to fade. First came the snoring. It started with Jebediah, a deep, rattling sound like rocks grinding together, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the very ground. Then Silas joined in, a higher, wheezing noise, punctuated by wet, gasping snorts. Billy was silent, but Clara imagined him passed out in his chair, too young or too foolish to keep up with the others. Silence. Not true silence, but the silence of a sleeping camp. The crackle of the dying fire outside was the only constant sound, a soft, rhythmic hiss against the backdrop of the men's oblivious breathing. The vast, empty wilderness pressed in on all sides. Now, it had to be now. Slowly, deliberately, Clara began to move. Every muscle in her body was a knot of pain. The bruises from her capture ached with a deep, throbbing rhythm. She shifted her weight, testing her bonds. The new ropes were thick and stiff, the knots expertly tied. Silas had made sure of that. She uncurled the fingers of her right hand. The piece of wire was still there, a small, hard secret she had guarded all afternoon. She'd kept her hand clenched into a fist for so long that her knuckles were white and her fingers stiff. With her left thumb, she maneuvered the wire until the sharp, angled end pointed outward, like a tiny, desperate claw. She held her hands up in the sliver of moonlight that crept under the ill-fitting door. She could just make out the thick, fibrous rope that bound her wrists. It looked impossibly strong. Her first attempt was clumsy. She tried to saw at the rope, but the wire was too short to get a good grip, and her bound hands made the angle awkward. The metal scraped uselessly against the coarse fibers, making a faint, scratching sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat, and listened. Only the snores, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind. She took a slow, steadying breath. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She had to be methodical, like her father at the forge, breaking down a complex task into a series of small, deliberate actions. She changed her position, bringing her knees to her chest and resting her bound wrists on them to brace herself. This gave her more stability. She positioned the sharp tip of the wire against a single strand of the rope and began to pull, not sawing, but scraping. It was a tedious, grueling process. The wire was dull, and the rope was strong. Scrape, pause, listen, scrape, pause, listen. The rhythm became a prayer, a mantra against the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. Her fingers were numb, her shoulders on fire. A drop of sweat trickled from her hairline and stung her eye, but she didn't dare move to wipe it away. After what felt like an eternity, a single fiber of the rope parted with a faint ping. It was a victory so small it was almost meaningless, but it sent a surge of fierce, wild hope through her. It could be done. She worked with renewed determination, her movements becoming more fluid, more practiced. She focused all her will, all her being, into that tiny point of contact where metal met fiber. She ignored the cramping in her legs and the burning in her back. She scraped and pulled, her world shrinking to the few inches of rope between her wrists. Then came the pain. In the darkness, she misjudged the angle, and the sharp end of the wire slipped, digging a deep gash into the soft flesh of her left wrist, right alongside the rope burn that was already there. A hot, sharp line of fire seared her skin. She bit down hard on her lip to stifle a cry, tasting the salt of her own blood. A warm trickle ran down her hand. The metallic scent of it filled her nostrils, a grim counterpoint to the smell of dust and old leather. She didn't stop. The pain only fueled her resolve, turning her fear into a cold, hard rage. Each drop of her blood was a price she was willing to pay. She repositioned the wire, her own blood now lubricating its path, and went back to work, one by one. The fibers gave way. She could feel the rope loosening, the tension lessening with each tiny victory. Finally, with a soft, tearing sound, the last strands parted. Her hands were free. For a moment, she just sat there, her arms limp in her lap, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical blow. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Blood, thick and sluggish, began to flow back into her numb fingers, bringing with it a pins and needles agony that was almost worse than the numbness had been. She flexed her fingers, wincing as the feeling returned. Her wrists were a raw, bloody mess, but they were free. She looked over at June, a small, vulnerable shape in the darkness. There was no question of leaving her behind. Clara crawled across the dirt floor, her bare feet silent. "June," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She gently shook the girl's shoulder. June started with a terrified gasp, her eyes flying open, wide and white in the gloom. "Shh," Clara breathed, pressing a finger to the girl's lips. "Be quiet. I'm going to get you loose." She showed June her own freed hands. The sight of the blood and the severed rope seemed to stun the younger girl into silence. June nodded, her body trembling. Clara moved behind her and took the wire. It was easier this time. She knew the rhythm now, and she could use both hands, applying more pressure. The rope around June's wrists parted in a fraction of the time it had taken to free herself. "Thank you," June mouthed, her eyes welling with tears. "There's no time," Clara whispered, her voice urgent. She pulled June to her feet. "Our boots, where are they?" They found them in the corner, tossed carelessly onto the pile of burlap sacks, their worn leather boots, their only protection against the harsh terrain outside. But as Clara reached for hers, she realized with a sinking heart that the laces had been taken. It was a simple, cruel precaution. The boots were useless. They would slow them down, trip them up. They had to go without. "We have to run," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "We run and we don't look back. Do you understand?" June nodded again, her face a pale oval of fear. Clara moved to the door. She pressed her ear against the rough wood, listening. The snores were still steady. The fire still crackled. Nothing had changed. She found the latch, a simple wooden bar dropped into 2 iron brackets. It was heavy, but it wasn't locked from the outside. She wrapped her torn, bloodied hands around the wooden bar. She took a deep breath, exchanging a final, wide-eyed look with June. Then, with infinite slowness, she lifted the bar. The wood scraped against the iron brackets, a low, groaning sound that seemed to echo for miles in the dead of night. She froze, every muscle tensed, waiting for a shout, for the sound of footsteps. Nothing. She lifted the bar free and carefully set it on the dirt floor. The door was now unlatched. This was the final threshold. Beyond it lay a freedom that was as terrifying as it was yearned for. She pushed the door open a crack. A sliver of cold night air washed over her face. The sky was vast and dark, the stars like chips of ice. The dying fire in the center of the small compound cast long, flickering shadows that writhed and danced like demons. She could see the main cabin, its single window dark. A few yards away, the horses were tethered, their shapes dark and hulking in the gloom. There was no one. Now, she breathed. Hand in hand, they slipped out of the shed. The ground was cold and sharp beneath their bare feet. Every pebble, every twig, was a small agony. They moved like ghosts, keeping to the deepest shadows, their thin shifts offering no protection from the biting chill. They skirted the edge of the firelight, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. Every crackle of the dying fire was a gunshot in the waiting. Every gust of wind was the sound of a boot on gravel. They made it past the main cabin. They were almost to the edge of the compound, where the darkness of the open plains began. And then a horse snorted. They both froze, their blood turning to ice. A dark figure shifted near the tethered horses. It was Billy, standing watch. He hadn't been passed out in the cabin after all. He was leaning against a post, his head slumped on his chest, half asleep but still there. They were trapped. To go forward would be to step right into his line of sight. To go back was impossible. Clara's eyes darted around, searching for any other way out. There was none. The compound was surrounded by open, flat ground. Then Billy shifted, stretched, and began to walk slowly toward the fire to warm his hands. His back turned to them. It was a window of a few seconds. It was their only chance. "Run," Clara whispered. And the word was not a suggestion, but a command that came from the most primal part of her soul. They ran. They abandoned all pretense of stealth and fled into the consuming darkness of the plains. Their bare feet slapped against the hard, unforgiving ground. Sharp stones and thorny weeds tore at their souls. Their lungs burned with the effort, the cold air a fire in their chests. They didn't dare look back to see if Billy had heard, if the alarm had been raised. To look back was to lose a precious second. They ran without direction, without a destination. Away. That was the only direction that mattered. The pinprick light of the captor's fire grew smaller and smaller behind them until it was just another star. And then it was gone, swallowed by the immense, indifferent darkness of the west. They were too small, desperate figures in a vast and hostile land, with no shoes, no water, and nothing but the terror at their backs to drive them forward. They just knew to run. The night was a merciless pursuer. It offered them no cover, only an endless expanse of sharp rocks and thorny brush that tore at their bare feet with every stumbling step. They ran until their lungs were twin fires in their chest, until their legs were leaden weights that refused to obey. Fear was the only fuel they had left, a bitter, frantic energy that burned through their exhaustion and drove them onward into the suffocating darkness. Clara held onto June's hand, her grip a desperate anchor in a sea of terror. The younger girl stumbled often, her breath coming in ragged, weeping gasps. Each time she fell, Clara would haul her back to her feet, whispering words of encouragement she herself did not believe. Just a little farther. Keep moving. They lost all track of time. The moon, a pale, accusing eye, wheeled across the star-dusted sky. The landscape was a shifting nightmare of monstrous shadows and unseen dangers. The howl of a distant coyote sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through their veins, and they would run faster, blindly, their only thought to put distance between themselves and the firelight they had left behind. Sometime in the deepest, coldest hour before dawn, their fuel ran out. June collapsed first, her legs simply giving way. She fell to the hard-packed earth without a sound, a small, discarded heap. Clara knelt beside her, every joint in her own body screaming in protest. She tried to pull June up, but her strength was gone. There was nothing left to give. They had run as far as their bodies would allow. Defeated, Clara sank down beside June, pulling the trembling girl close for warmth against the biting chill of the desert night. Thirst was a living thing inside her, a creature with claws and teeth, tearing at the lining of her throat. Her feet were a mangled ruin of cuts and bruises, the pain so immense it had become a dull, constant throb, a new and terrible part of her. She looked back the way they had come. There was nothing, just an endless, empty blackness. She looked forward, the same. They had run from a cage only to find themselves in a prison infinitely larger, a wasteland without walls. For the first time, a true and profound despair began to settle over her, cold and heavy as a burial shroud. She must have dozed, for she woke with a start to a change in the light. The absolute black had softened to a deep, bruised purple at the eastern horizon. Dawn was coming. The pale, gray light crept across the land, revealing the stark reality of their surroundings. They were in a vast, flat basin of dry, yellow grass, dotted with skeletal creosote bushes. In every direction, the land stretched away to meet the sky, empty and unforgiving. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. As the sun's first rays breached the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of pale pink and gold, the world began to shimmer. A heat haze was already rising from the parched earth, distorting the air, making the distance tremble and swim. And out of that trembling, hazy distance, a figure emerged. It was a man. He was too far away to see clearly. A tall, dark silhouette walking steadily through the rising heat. Clara's heart seized in her chest, a cold dread, sharper and more immediate than the despair she'd felt moments before, washed over her. Had they found them? Was this Jebediah or Silas, come to drag them back? She shook June awake. "Someone's coming," she rasped, her voice a dry crackle. June's eyes fluttered open, clouded with exhaustion and delirium. She tried to push herself up, then fell back with a weak groan. "I can't," she whimpered. "Clara, I can't run anymore." "We don't run," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the approaching figure. "We stay still." She pulled June down, pressing them both flat against the ground in the sparse cover of a patch of taller grass. It was a pathetic attempt at concealment, a child's hiding place, but it was all they had. Lying with her cheek against the cool, dusty earth, Clara watched the man's slow, deliberate approach. He was not hurrying. His pace was that of a man with a purpose, unbothered and unthreatened. This, somehow, was more unnerving than if he'd been running. He carried something in his right hand that glinted in the new sunlight, a metal bucket, and coiled over his left shoulder was a thick length of rope. The rope sent a fresh wave of fear through Clara. A rope had bound her wrists. A rope could become a noose. A man with a rope in this lawless land was a man who dealt in capture, in possession. Yet he also carried a bucket, water, life. He was a walking contradiction, a figure of both salvation and damnation, and he was walking directly toward them. Clara's mind raced. He couldn't have seen them. Not yet. They were too small, too low to the ground. He must be walking a familiar path, heading for a well or a creek. If they stayed perfectly still, he might pass by without ever knowing they were there. But the water, the glint of that bucket was a siren's call to her parched and dying body. Her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to let the danger pass. But the thirst was a more powerful instinct, a primal command that was beginning to override all reason. He was closer now. She could make out the details. He wore dusty, worn denim pants and a faded cotton shirt. A wide-brimmed hat, stained with sweat and dirt, was pulled low, casting his entire face in a deep, impenetrable shadow. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and he moved with an easy, economical grace. He was not one of her former captors. He was a stranger, and in the West, a stranger was a question mark that could be answered with a bullet. He was perhaps 50 yards away when he stopped. He stood completely still for a long moment, his shadowed face turned in their direction. He had seen them. Clara's blood ran cold. The moment of decision was upon her. Hide like a frightened rabbit, or face the wolf. June began to sob quietly beside her, a sound of pure, helpless terror. Something inside Clara hardened. She had been prey for long enough. She had run and hidden and bled, and it had brought her here, to this patch of dirt, to die of thirst under an indifferent sky. She would not die cowering in the grass. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself into a sitting position. The movement was a declaration. "Here I am," June gasped, but Clara ignored her. She sat straight, her chin up, and waited. The man watched her for another long moment. He did not call out. He did not draw a weapon. He simply resumed walking, his pace just as steady and unhurried as before, until he stood a mere 10 feet away. He loomed over them, a towering figure against the bright morning sky. From this angle, she still couldn't see his face, only the dark, sun-weathered skin of his jaw and the firm line of his mouth. He looked from Clara to the wretched, weeping form of June, then down at their bare, bloodied feet. His gaze was slow and methodical, taking in every detail of their pathetic state. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. It was a test. Clara knew it. He was waiting to see what she would do. Her throat felt like it was lined with sand. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, clicking sound came out. She swallowed, a painful, desperate effort. She thought of the water in his bucket, cool and clean, and the thought gave her the strength to try again. "Water," she croaked, the single word a shard of glass in her throat. "Please." It was the ultimate surrender, an admission of her desperation, her complete and utter helplessness. She had placed her life, and June's, entirely in his hands. The man did not reply. For a heart-stopping second, she thought he would turn and walk away, leaving them to their fate. Instead, he moved. In one smooth, deliberate motion, he bent at the knees, his movements quiet and controlled. He set the heavy galvanized bucket on the ground, placing it carefully between them. The water inside sloshed, a sound more beautiful than any music. He straightened up, still looking down at them from beneath the shadow of his hat. Then he spoke. His voice was low and steady, a gravelly baritone that held no discernible emotion, not pity, not anger, not kindness. It was simply a voice stating a fact. "It's not cold," he said, "but it's clean." The water was life. Clara dipped her cupped, trembling hands into the bucket and brought the precious liquid to her lips. It was lukewarm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever known. It sluiced the dust from her throat and seemed to extinguish a fire that had been burning inside her for an eternity. Beside her, June drank with a desperate, sobbing thirst, water splashing down her chin and onto the front of her ragged shift. The man stood watching them, his posture relaxed but attentive. He was a silent, unmoving pillar in the vast, empty landscape. He had not asked their names, nor where they had come from, nor why their feet were bleeding and their wrists were raw. He had simply given them water, and now he was giving them the space to drink it. The coil of rope on his shoulder and the worn Colt peacemaker holstered on his hip were still stark reminders of the potential for violence that every man in this land seemed to carry. But his stillness felt less like a threat and more like a patient, waiting strength. Clara drank more slowly now, allowing her body to absorb the life-giving moisture. She risked a glance up at him, studying him from beneath her lashes. She still could not see his eyes, but she saw the hard line of his jaw, stubbled with several days' growth of beard, and the way the sun had tanned his skin to the color of worn leather. He was not a young man, but not old either. There were lines of experience etched around his mouth and across his brow, lines that spoke of too much sun and too many hard decisions. His hands, resting loosely at his sides, were large and calloused. The hands of a man who worked the land. He was a rancher, she guessed. His name was Will, she would later learn. But for now, he was just the quiet, watchful man who had appeared out of the shimmering heat of dawn. For a few precious minutes, there was a fragile peace. The only sounds were their own quiet drinking, the whisper of the wind through the dry grass, and the vast, humming silence of the plains. The terror of the night began to recede, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to feel a flicker of something other than fear. It was not hope, not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was the simple, animal gratitude of having survived the night. The peace was shattered by a sound. It began as a faint, rhythmic vibration felt more through the soles of her feet than heard with her ears. The man Will heard it first. His head came up, his body instantly losing its relaxed posture and becoming utterly still, a predator sensing a change in the wind. He turned his head slightly, his shadowed gaze fixed on the eastern horizon. Then Clara heard it, the distant, frantic drumming of a horse's hooves, moving at a full gallop. It was not the sound of a casual rider. It was the sound of pursuit, of rage. June heard it too, and a fresh wave of terror washed the life from her face. "They found us," she breathed, her voice shaking. The drumming grew louder, closer, a frantic heartbeat against the silence. A speck appeared on the horizon, trailing a plume of dust behind it. It grew rapidly, resolving itself into the shape of a horse and rider, even from a distance. Clara recognized the furious, reckless way the man rode. It was Silas. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. She felt an instinctual urge to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. Her body was a wreck, and they were exposed in the open. She looked at Will. He hadn't moved. He stood as if rooted to the earth, a calm bulwark against the approaching storm. He did not draw his weapon. He simply watched and waited. Silas thundered toward them, his face a dark knot of fury. He reined his horse in so hard it reared back on its haunches, hooves pawing at the air, its terrified whinny tearing through the morning quiet. It came down with a jarring thud, kicking up a cloud of dust that enveloped them all. Silas sat panting on the heaving horse, his chest rising and falling. His face was blotchy and red, his eyes wild with a feral rage. He had a dirty bandage wrapped around one hand, likely from a brawl the night before. His pistol was already in his other hand, held loosely but with clear intent. His venomous gaze fell on Clara and June, huddled by the bucket. Then he turned his attention to Will, his lip curling back in a sneer. "You," he spat, his voice raw with anger. "Step away from them." Will didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands. His voice, when he spoke, was unnervingly calm, a low rumble that cut through Silas's frantic energy. "They're getting water." "I don't give a damn what they're getting," Silas roared, his knuckles white on the grip of his gun. He gestured at them with the barrel of the pistol. "Those two are mine." The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Mine, the claim of ownership, the final, absolute denial of their humanity. It was a brand, a verbal shackle, and it snapped something in the tense quiet of the morning. Will's movement was a blur. It was not a decision, but a reaction, as swift and as final as a lightning strike. One moment he was standing still, his hand resting at his side. The next, his hand had swept down, the Colt peacemaker appearing in his grip as if by magic. There was no aiming, no hesitation. There was only the smooth, practiced draw and the single, deafening crack of the gunshot. The sound was a physical blow, a punch of sound that echoed across the plains and back again. Silas screamed, a high, shocked sound of pain and disbelief. His pistol flew from his grasp, spinning end over end before clattering into the dirt. He dropped the reins and clutched at his right shoulder, his face contorting in agony. A dark, wet stain was already spreading across the fabric of his shirt. The horse, terrified by the gunshot and its rider's sudden cry, bolted. It spun around and galloped away, with Silas clinging precariously to the saddle horn, yelling curses and threats that were lost to the wind. In a matter of seconds, he was gone, just a disappearing cloud of dust on the horizon. The silence that rushed back in was profound, ringing, absolute. A thin tendril of smoke curled from the barrel of Will's revolver. He hadn't moved from his spot. He stood with the gun still level, his arm steady, his face an unreadable mask beneath the shadow of his hat. He lowered the pistol slowly, the click of the hammer being cocked back into safety shockingly loud in the stillness. He slid the gun back into its holster and finally turned his head to look at Clara. She couldn't see his eyes, but she felt his gaze. Then he spoke, his voice as quiet and as hard as granite. "Nobody belongs to anybody out here." The words settled over Clara, simple and direct and more powerful than any sermon. She looked from the empty horizon where Silas had vanished, to the gun on Will's hip, and then back to his shadowed face. He had not offered them comfort. He had not promised them safety. He had not rescued them. He had simply, and with brutal efficiency, enforced a principle. "Those two are mine," Silas had said. "Nobody belongs to anybody out here," Will had answered, not with words, but with a bullet. Clara stared at him, at this silent, violent, and strangely honorable man. The ringing in her ears began to fade, and in the quiet that followed, a new understanding dawned. All her life, she had been someone's daughter, someone's responsibility, and almost someone's property. She had been passed from one hand to another, her value determined by others. But this man, this stranger, had not fought to claim her. He had fought against the very idea that she could be claimed. For the very first time, someone had stood up for her, not as an object to be protected or possessed, but as a person whose freedom was a fact as real and as unyielding as the land itself. The realization struck her with the force of the gunshot, and in the desolate, sun-scorched middle of nowhere, something inside her that had been broken began to mend. The echo of the gunshot faded, leaving a silence that was heavier than before. The empty horizon offered no more threats, but the air was still charged with the residue of violence. Will holstered his pistol, the motion economical and final. He gave the distant cloud of dust one last, dismissive glance before turning his attention back to them. He didn't speak. He simply picked up the water bucket, his movements unhurried, and gave a short, deliberate nod in the direction from which he had come. It was not a request. It was a simple, factual statement. "We are going this way now." There was nothing to do but obey. Clara pushed herself to her feet, her body a single, unified chorus of pain. Every muscle ached, and the raw, hamburgered soles of her feet screamed as her weight settled on them. She helped June up, the younger girl leaning heavily on her face pale and slack with shock and exhaustion. The journey began. Will walked ahead of them, his long, steady stride setting a pace that was surprisingly manageable. He seemed to know, without looking back, exactly how fast their savaged feet would allow them to travel. He didn't offer words of comfort or ask questions. His silence was a kind of courtesy, a heavy blanket that allowed them to exist within their own private spheres of pain and relief, without the need to perform or explain. They walked for what felt like an hour, though it was likely less. The sun climbed higher, and the morning heat began to assert itself. The land was a study in harsh beauty, undulating waves of dry, golden grass, punctuated by the dark green of stubborn brush and the occasional, skeletal silhouette of a yucca plant. It was a land that demanded strength, that offered no quarter to the weak. Clara wondered how a man could survive here alone. June began to falter, her steps growing more unsteady, her breathing more ragged. Just as Clara thought the girl might collapse, Will stopped. He turned, his face still an unreadable shadow beneath his hat. He looked at June for a long moment, then walked back to them. He didn't say a word. He simply took June's other arm and slung it over his own broad shoulders, taking on most of her weight. The gesture was impersonal, practical, like lifting a sack of feed. Yet it was an act of profound kindness. He bore her weight without complaint, adjusting his stride to hers, and they continued on. They crested a low, sun-baked rise, and there it was, his home. The word ranch was too grand for it. It was the simplest, most elemental form of shelter Clara had ever seen. A small cabin sat in the center of a shallow basin, its walls made of thick, hand-hewn logs, the gaps chinked with dried mud and grass. It looked less like it had been built upon the land, and more like it had grown out of it, as solid and as natural as the rocky outcrops behind it. Beside the cabin stood a tall, skeletal windmill, its metal blades turning with a slow, rhythmic groan in the steady breeze. The sound was a lonely one, a constant, metallic sigh that seemed to be the only voice in this vast emptiness. A simple corral, made of rough-cut posts and rails, stood empty save for a single, sturdy-looking sorrel horse that raised its head to watch them approach. There was a water trough, a small woodshed, and nothing else. No barn, no fields of crops, no sign of any other human life for 100 miles in any direction. This was a place of solitude, a fortress of self-reliance. As they drew closer, the feeling of safety, so fragile and uncertain before, began to solidify. It was the isolation that did it. Out here, the world and its dangers felt a universe away. The creak and groan of the windmill became a comforting, steady heartbeat. This was Will's world, a place he had carved out for himself, and for now, he was allowing them to shelter within its borders. He led them to the cabin's single door and pushed it open, holding it for them to enter. The interior was dark and cool after the glare of the sun. It was one main room, and it smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and clean dust. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A simple, sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. Against the far wall was a dry sink with a cast-iron pump, a small cooking stove, and shelves holding a few tin plates, cups, and basic provisions. Everything was meticulously neat, arranged with a purpose. There was no clutter, no softness, no decoration of any kind. It was the living space of a man who owned only what was necessary. Will guided the near-unconscious June to one of the chairs, easing her down gently. He then turned to the pump. He worked the handle, and with a series of groans and clanks, water gushed out into the basin below. He gestured toward it. "Wash up," he said. It was the first thing he had said to them since his confrontation with Silas. Clara moved to the sink as if in a dream, the cool water on her face, On her arms, on the raw, bloody skin of her wrists, was a balm. She washed away the grime and the sweat and the terror of the last 2 days. And with each splash of water, she felt a layer of her ordeal being stripped away. She helped June wash, the girl barely able to hold her own head up. When they were done, Will was waiting with 2 folded squares of fabric in his hands. They were his own shirts, made of clean, soft, faded blue cotton. He held them out to Clara. "These'll be better," he said, his gaze directed somewhere over her shoulder, as if to grant her a measure of privacy. She took them. They were huge on her and June, the sleeves hanging down past their fingertips, the hems reaching their knees like dresses, but they were clean. They smelled faintly of soap and the sun. To shed their torn, filthy shifts and pull on these clean garments felt like a resurrection. Will moved to the stove, his back to them. He took a skillet from a hook, found a slab of bacon and a sack of flour. Without a word, he began to prepare food. The simple domestic sounds the sizzle of bacon in the pan. The clink of utensils filled the quiet cabin. It was the most comforting sound Clara had ever heard. He worked with a quiet efficiency, never looking at them, granting them the dignity of being ignored, of not being watched. He was giving them time to breathe, to simply be. He served the food on the tin plates, hot biscuits and salty bacon, and placed them on the table along with 2 cups of water. He took none for himself. He simply nodded toward the meal and then walked outside, leaving the door ajar. Through it, Clara could see him checking the rigging on the windmill, his movements slow and methodical. He was making himself busy, making himself absent, so they would not feel like prisoners under the watch of a guard. Clara had to coax June to eat, but she herself ate with a hunger that was almost painful. The simple, hearty food was a profound comfort, anchoring her to the present moment, to the solid reality of this table and this cabin. When they had finished, Will came back inside. He picked up their empty plates without comment and placed them in the sink. The sun was high now, pouring through the open doorway. "You need to rest," he said. It was a statement, not a question. He led them to a door in the back wall she hadn't noticed before. It opened into a small, spare room, containing little more than a narrow bed with a simple mattress and a folded wool blanket. This was clearly his bedroom. He was giving them his bed. He stood in the doorway, not crossing the threshold, his large frame filling the space. He gestured to a thick, heavy wooden bar resting in brackets on the inside of the door. "The door locks from the inside," he said, his voice low and even. "There's a heavy bolt, if that helps you sleep any better." The words struck Clara with a physical force. He understood. He understood the terror of being helpless, of being locked in, and he was giving them the key. He was offering them not just shelter, but control, the power to bolt the door, to shut the world out, to create their own sanctuary. It was a gift of immense understanding, of profound empathy, from a man who spoke in actions, not words. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She tried to speak, to form the simple words of gratitude that were so wholly inadequate for what she was feeling. "Thank you," she began, but the words caught in her throat, choked by an overwhelming wave of emotion. She could not speak, so she simply looked at him. She held his gaze, or rather, the shadowed space where she knew his gaze was, and poured all of her gratitude, all of her relief, all of the fragile, burgeoning trust she felt, into that one look. Will stood for a long moment, receiving her silent message. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. He understood. Then he turned and walked back into the main room, pulling the door to his bedroom gently closed, leaving them alone. Clara stepped forward and slid the heavy wooden bolt into its iron bracket. The sound it made, a solid, definitive thunk, was the sound of a key turning in a lock. It was the sound of safety. She leaned her forehead against the cool, rough wood of the door, and for the first time since she'd woken up in a dark, jolting crate, she allowed herself to believe that she might just survive. Sleep was a shallow, treacherous country, and Clara had spent the night wandering its borders. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, was the sound of a footstep, the scrape of a bolt. She woke with the first pale light of dawn, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom weight of the small derringer still in her hand. June was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting in the lap of Will's oversized shirt. The terror had settled deep inside her, a permanent resident in the house of her soul. She looked at Clara, her eyes wide and haunted. The temporary safety of the cabin felt like a dream that was already beginning to fade. Clara slid the heavy bolt back. The sound was loud in the morning quiet. She opened the door and stepped into the main room. Will was already at the stove, a tin pot of coffee bubbling over a low flame. He turned as she entered, his shadowed face giving nothing away. He simply nodded toward the pot, then to 2 tin cups on the table. It was his way of saying good morning. She poured 2 cups of the strong, black coffee. The warmth of the cup was a comfort against her cold hands. She gave one to June, who had followed her out. They sat at the table, sipping the bitter brew, listening to the familiar, lonely groan of the windmill. For a while, it seemed like a normal morning. The light streaming through the open cabin door was clean and bright. A bird sang from the roof of the woodshed. The world felt calm, sane. It was Will who broke the spell. He was standing in the doorway, looking out at the vast expanse of his land, his body unnaturally still. He held his own cup of coffee, but he wasn't drinking. He was listening to something beyond the song of the bird, beyond the sigh of the windmill. "Stay inside," he said. His voice was quiet, but it had the flat, hard finality of a closing door. Clara's blood ran cold. She moved to his side, peering past his broad frame. At first, she saw nothing, just the endless sea of golden grass, shimmering in the morning sun. Then she saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the bright eastern sky. They were not moving fast. They were coming at a walk, a slow, deliberate, funereal pace that was far more menacing than a charge, even from a distance. Clara recognized the broad, powerful form of Jebediah in the lead. To his left rode Silas, his right arm in a crude sling, his body slumped in the saddle with a posture of pure, simmering malice. The third rider was the boy, Billy, his face a pale dot of misery. They were coming back, not in a frantic chase, but as a delegation of vengeance. "June, get back in the room," Clara said, her voice tight. "Bolt the door!" June didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled back into the bedroom, and Clara heard the heavy thunk of the bolt sliding home. Will turned from the door, his movements calm and purposeful. He walked to a long, low chest that rested against the wall beneath the cabin's only window. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in oiled cloths, were several firearms. He took out his own Colt and checked the load, his fingers moving with an ingrained, practiced efficiency. Then he took out 2 other pistols. They were smaller, older, a pair of single-shot derringers. They were weapons of last resort, easily concealed but effective only at close range. He loaded each one with a fat, lead cartridge, his face a mask of concentration. He walked back to Clara and pressed one of the small, heavy pistols into her hand. It felt cold and alien, a dense, terrifying weight. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked, his voice low. "My father taught me," she whispered, her throat dry, "to shoot rats in the barn." "This ain't a rat," Will said, his shadowed gaze boring into her. He picked up her hand, forcing her fingers to grip the pistol correctly. "It's 1 shot. You make it count. You wait for my signal. You only shoot when I shoot. Understand?" Clara nodded, her mind reeling. The situation was escalating with a terrifying speed. Yesterday, he had been her protector. Today, he was making her a soldier. "Take the window," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Stay low. Don't show yourself until I tell you." He moved to the door, taking up a position just inside the frame, where he could see out but remain mostly in shadow. Clara crept to the window, the rough wood of the sill pressing into her forearms. She peered out. The three riders had stopped about 30 yards from the cabin, just beyond easy pistol range. They sat on their horses, a silent, menacing tribunal. Jebediah was the one who spoke, his voice a deep, carrying rumble. "Will, we know you're in there, and we know you have our property." Will didn't answer. The silence stretched, a taut wire of tension. Clara could hear her own heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. The derringer in her hand was slick with sweat. "We don't want any more trouble than we've already had," Jebediah called out, his tone a mockery of reason. "We're prepared to be reasonable. Just send the girls out, and we'll be on our way." Will's voice, when it came, was as calm and as solid as the log walls around them. "They're not property, and they're not coming out." From his position in the saddle, Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Then we'll come in and get 'em," he snarled, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. Jebediah put a hand on his arm, stopping him. He looked at the cabin, his eyes narrowed in calculation. "Look," he said, trying a different tack. "There was a misunderstanding. A business deal went sour. I'm prepared to offer you a refund for the trouble we caused you. Let's just call this a bad investment and we can all walk away." The insult was so profound, so utterly dehumanizing, that it took Clara's breath away. A refund, as if she and June were faulty merchandise being returned to the store. Will's answer was the click of his pistol's hammer being cocked. The sound was small, but it carried across the yard with terrible clarity. That was the end of the negotiation. Silas, consumed by his rage, could wait no longer. With a guttural yell, he ripped his pistol from its holster with his good hand. To hell with this. He fired. The shot went wide, thudding harmlessly into the log wall a foot to the left of the door. But it was the first shot. It was the signal. The world exploded in a cacophony of noise and violence. "Now," Will yelled. Clara rose up, leveling the derringer over the windowsill, her hands shaking violently. Jebediah and Billy were already firing, their pistols barking, sending bullets splintering into the cabin's facade. A shot smashed through the window, showering Clara with shards of glass. But she barely felt the sting of the cuts. Her entire world had narrowed to the scene outside. Will fired back from the doorway, not wildly, but with a cold, deliberate aim. He was not shooting at Jebediah, the leader. He was not shooting at Silas, the immediate threat. His target was the weakest link. Billy cried out, a thin, surprised sound, like a boy who had stubbed his toe. He dropped his pistol and clutched at his chest, a dark stain blossoming on his simple shirt. He looked down at it, his face a mask of confusion, and then he simply toppled sideways out of his saddle, hitting the ground with a soft, final thud. The sight of the boy falling broke the momentum of the attack. Jebediah let out a roar of fury and disbelief. Silas, his face white with shock, fumbled to reload his pistol. They had made a fatal error. They had assumed a prolonged fight, an exchange of fire from a distance. They had not counted on Will's brutal, unerring efficiency. In the space of 2 heartbeats, their advantage in numbers was gone. Now Will moved. He exploded from the doorway, not running for cover, but charging straight toward them. It was a move of such insane, predatory confidence that it stunned his remaining opponents into a half-second of inaction. And a half-second was all he needed. He fired again. The bullet kicked up the dirt right in front of Jebediah's horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the big man off balance. At the same time, Will closed the remaining distance to Silas, his body low. He slammed his shoulder into Silas's horse, sending it stumbling sideways, and brought the heavy barrel of his Colt down in a vicious arc on Silas's gun hand. There was a sickening crack of bone, and Silas screamed, his pistol falling into the dust. It was over, as quickly as it had begun. Jebediah, fighting to control his terrified horse, looked down at his dead companion, then at Silas, who was cradling his shattered hand and whimpering in pain. He looked at Will, who stood between them, his pistol held steady, his face a grim, shadowed promise of more death to come. The fight was gone from Jebediah's eyes, replaced by the cold, hard calculation of a man who knows he is beaten. He slowly, deliberately, raised his hands in the air. Will did not lower his gun. He walked over and picked up Silas's pistol, then Billy's, tucking them into his belt. He kicked Jebediah's fallen revolver away into the grass. He stood there, master of the field, the silence broken only by Silas's pathetic moans and the heaving breath of the horses. "Get him on his horse," Will ordered, his voice flat, "and get out of here." Jebediah dismounted, his movements stiff. He hauled the whimpering Silas back into the saddle, then went to his own horse. He hesitated, looking at Billy's still form on the ground. "Leave him," Will said, his voice like ice. Jebediah's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He was about to mount his horse when Will spoke again. "Wait." Will reached into his own saddlebag, which was slung over the corral fence. He pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He tossed it through the air, and it landed in the dust at Jebediah's feet with a solid, metallic chink. "Take it," Will said, "and never come back. If I ever see your face on my land again, I will bury you on it." Jebediah stared at the pouch of gold, then up at Will, his face a mixture of confusion and humiliation. He bent down, snatched the pouch from the dirt, and swung himself into the saddle. Without a backward glance at his dead companion, he grabbed the reins of Silas's horse and kicked his own into a gallop, dragging the wounded man behind him. They rode away, two defeated figures disappearing back into the vast emptiness of the plains. Clara lowered the derringer, her arm trembling with the strain. She hadn't fired a single shot. She stumbled out of the cabin into the bright, clean morning air, which now stank of gunpowder and blood. Her gaze fell on the still form of the boy, Billy, lying in the dirt, his eyes open to the empty blue sky. Then she looked at Will. He was already reloading his pistol, ejecting the spent shells and replacing them with fresh cartridges, his hands steady, his focus absolute. It was a simple, necessary task, like sharpening a tool after a hard job. She walked toward him, her savaged feet barely registering the sharp stones. He finished reloading and slid the Colt back into its holster. He looked at her, and for the first time, the morning sun caught him at an angle that allowed her to see his eyes. They were a pale, clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, profound weariness. She struggled to find the words to encompass the horror, the violence, the strange, brutal transaction she had just witnessed. He hadn't just saved them. He had done something more complicated, something more final. She finally found her voice, a small, trembling whisper in the ringing silence. You just bought our freedom." Will looked at the pouch of gold he had thrown, then back at her. He gave a single, slow nod. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I just paid them to go away. Freedom. Freedom isn't something you can buy." The silence that followed their departure was heavier than any sound. It was a silence filled with the ghost of gunfire and the stark, undeniable presence of the body lying in the yard. The boy, Billy, looked impossibly young, his face peaceful in a way it had likely never been in life, his eyes staring up at a sky that offered no answers. Will did not allow the silence to linger. He moved with a grim, methodical purpose that was both chilling and deeply comforting. There were no wasted motions, no moments of hesitation. He retrieved a thick wool blanket from his cabin, one that had seen many winters, and gently covered the boy's body. He then went to the corral, saddled his sorrel horse, and led it to the front of the cabin. He looked at Clara, his gray eyes holding a deep and abiding weariness. "Go inside," he said. The words were not unkind, but they were a command. This was his task, his burden to bear. He did not want an audience. Clara took June, who was weeping silently, and led her back into the cabin. She did not bolt the door this time. She sat at the table and listened. She heard the soft sounds of Will lifting the body, the grunt of effort, and the gentle thud as he secured it across the saddle. She heard the creak of leather as he mounted, and then the soft, steady rhythm of hoofbeats fading into the vast, open country. He was taking the boy away, out to some lonely, unmarked spot on the plains, to return him to the earth with a dignity he had been denied in the final moments of his life. He was gone for hours. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down on the small, isolated homestead. The only sound was the constant, mournful groan of the windmill, turning and turning as if trying to grind the memory of the morning into dust. Clara and June did not speak. There were no words for what they had seen, for what they had been saved from. They were adrift in the aftermath, two souls in a silent house, waiting for their taciturn keeper to return. When he finally rode back into the yard, the sun was beginning its slow descent in the west. The back of his horse was empty. He dismounted, unsaddled the animal, and rubbed it down with a careful, soothing rhythm before turning it out into the corral. He pumped water into the trough, his movements economical and weary. He had buried the dead, and now he was tending to the living. He did all this without once looking toward the cabin, without acknowledging their presence. That evening, a new kind of quiet settled over them. It was not the tense, watchful silence of their first night, nor the charged, violent silence of the morning. It was a silence born of shared trauma, a tacit agreement to not speak of the things that were too large and too terrible for words. They ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread that Will prepared. No one spoke of the empty chair at the table that Billy would never occupy, nor of the pouch of gold that had sealed their fate. They ate, and the act of sharing a meal became a quiet ritual, a confirmation that they were still alive. The days that followed fell into a pattern dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Will would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to disturb them. He would be out for hours, riding the perimeter of his unseen property, checking for stray cattle, mending fences that seemed to exist only in his mind. He worked with a relentless, inexhaustible energy, as if physical labor was the only way to keep the ghosts at bay. He rarely spoke. His language was the thud of an axe splitting wood, the creak of the windmill's pump handle, the soft murmur of his voice as he calmed his horse. Clara and June existed in a strange limbo. They were safe, cared for, but they were guests with no end to their stay. They had been given sanctuary, but they had no purpose. The feeling of being a burden began to gnaw at Clara. She watched Will toil from sunup to sundown, his solitude so complete that their presence seemed an intrusion. She knew they could not repay him for what he had done for the life he had taken, for the gold he had spent, but she could not bear to be idle. One morning, a few days after the gunfight, she found a broom leaning against the woodshed. It was a crude thing, a thick branch of mesquite with a bundle of stiff twigs tied to the end with rawhide. It was a tool Will had made, like everything else here, on an impulse. She took it and began to sweep the packed earth in front of the cabin door. The work was simple, repetitive. The rhythmic swish-swish of the broom was a soothing sound. She swept away the dust, the stray leaves, the memory of the scuffed dirt where men had fought and died. She was not just cleaning. She was creating order. She was smoothing a space, making a threshold. It was a small act, almost meaningless in the face of the vast, untamed wilderness around them. But it was hers. For the first time in a very long time. She was not reacting, not running, not hiding. She was acting. She was contributing. June, seeing Clara at work, found her own purpose. She was still fragile, prone to bouts of weeping and long, silent stares at the horizon, but she had always found comfort in the kitchen beside her mother. She began to take over the preparation of the midday meal. She was not a skilled cook, and their provisions were simple, but she learned to make decent biscuits, to cook beans until they were tender, to make a thin but savory stew from jerky and wild onions. The small cabin began to fill with the smells of a home. Will never commented on these changes. He simply accepted them. He would return from his work in the middle of the day, his face and shirt stained with sweat and dust, and find the yard swept clean. He would sit down at the table, and a plate of warm food would be placed before him. He would eat in his usual silence. But Clara saw the way the tight lines around his eyes would soften. Just for a moment. He would nod his thanks a single, brief dip of his chin, and that was enough. No one had given any orders. No one had assigned any tasks. A routine had simply been born out of the quiet, unspoken needs of 3 wounded people. Will provided the shelter and the protection. Clara and June provided the small, domestic comforts that turned a shelter into a home. They were 3 strangers, bound by violence and circumstance, and they were slowly, imperceptibly, becoming something that resembled a family. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, bathing the plains in a soft, golden light, the 3 of them sat outside the cabin. The oppressive heat of the day had finally broken, and a cool breeze whispered through the dry grass. Will sat on the cabin step, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone a peaceful, meditative sound. June sat nearby, mending a tear in the sleeve of her borrowed shirt, her needle moving with a newfound, quiet confidence. Clara leaned against a porch post, her gaze fixed on the endless, beautiful, and terrifying landscape. The world was so big, so empty, it had almost swallowed her whole. She thought of her life before, of the family she had lost, the small town she had called home. It all felt like a story that had happened to someone else, a lifetime ago. She had been stripped of everything, right down to her own name, until she was nothing but a piece of frightened cargo in a wooden box. The quiet of the evening was so profound, the sense of peace so fragile and so precious, that a thought she had been holding deep inside her rose to the surface, demanding to be spoken. She spoke into the golden silence, her voice not much louder than the breeze. "I thought I had lost everything," she said softly, almost to herself. "My family, my home, my name. I thought it was all gone." The sound of the whetstone stopped. June's needle paused in mid-stitch. They were both listening, giving her the space for her words. Clara turned her head, looking at the 2 of them, at this silent man and this broken girl who were now the entire population of her world. She looked at the sturdy cabin, at the endless sky, at the soft, forgiving light. "But maybe," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, a hint of wonder. "Sitting here now, maybe I still have something left." The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, like a slow, deep breath after a lifetime of running. The fierce, unforgiving heat of summer bled out of the land, replaced by the crisp, golden light of autumn. The nights grew colder, demanding an extra blanket on the bed and a fire in the hearth. The constant groan of the windmill became the steady, predictable heartbeat of their new life. Time, which had once been a terrifying expanse of uncertainty, became a friend. It softened the sharp edges of their trauma and allowed their wounds, both visible and unseen, to begin to heal. The cuts on Clara's feet faded from angry red lines to pale, silvery scars, and the soles of her feet grew tough and calloused, accustomed to the feel of the hard, dry earth. June's haunted, vacant stare was gradually replaced by a shy, tentative smile. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their terrors chased away by the solid reality of the cabin walls and the low, rumbling sound of Will's snoring from his bedroll by the fire. They worked. They had to. Work was the antidote to memory. the loom on which they could weave a new sense of purpose. Clara's daily sweeping of the yard became a ritual of order and control. June's cooking became more confident, and the cabin was often filled with the comforting smells of baking bread or simmering stew. They patched the tears in Will's work clothes, their needles moving with a steady, focused rhythm. They were small, domestic acts, but they were acts of creation in a world that had tried to destroy them. Will watched it all from his quiet, reserved distance. He never offered praise, but he showed his approval in small, unspoken ways. He built a new, sturdier chair for June to sit on, one that didn't wobble. He fashioned a small wooden box for Clara to keep her mending supplies in. He would sometimes leave a cluster of wild prairie flowers on the table in the morning, a splash of color against the drabness of the cabin. These were his words, his expressions of gratitude and affection, written in the language of wood and stone and iron. One afternoon, Clara found their original shifts, the ones they had been wearing when they arrived. Will had washed them and left them folded at the bottom of the chest where he kept his own clothes. They were torn, stained, and threadbare, grim artifacts of their ordeal. For a long time, she hadn't been able to bring herself to touch them. But now, she took them out. She and June spent the rest of the day mending them, with steady hands. They stitched the ripped seams, patched the holes with scraps of burlap, and washed them again until the fabric was soft and clean. As Clara held up her mended shift, turning it over in the fading afternoon light, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It was still a poor, humble garment, but it was whole. And it was hers. She had taken something that was broken and made it useful again. That night, a full, luminous moon hung in the black, star-dusted sky, bathing the plains in a soft, ethereal glow. The air was still and cold. June was already asleep in their room, her breathing deep and even. Will was still outside. He often worked late, as if he were at war with the darkness itself, determined to hold it back with the sheer force of his will. Clara looked at the clean, blue cotton shirt that she had been wearing for weeks. It was Will's. It had been her armor, her shield, a symbol of the safety he had given her. She had washed it and mended a small tear near the cuff. Now, she folded it carefully, the worn fabric soft beneath her fingers. It was time. She slipped out of the cabin, her bare feet silent on the cold, packed earth. The world was silver and black, the familiar shapes of the corral and the woodshed transformed by the moonlight. The windmill was a silent, skeletal sentinel against the sky. She saw the soft, flickering glow of a lantern near the far corner of the corral. He was there. She walked toward the light, the folded shirt held in both hands like an offering. He was fixing a section of the fence rail that had been split by a stray bullet during the gunfight. He worked with a focused intensity, his back to her, the muscles in his shoulders and arms moving with a powerful, rhythmic grace as he planed the wood smooth. He was a man who was constantly mending things, constantly building and rebuilding the boundaries of their small, safe world. He must have sensed her approach, for he stopped his work before she was more than a few feet away. He didn't turn around immediately. He simply straightened up, his head cocked as if listening. Then he turned slowly. His face, illuminated from below by the warm, yellow light of the lantern, was a landscape of shadows and deep lines. He looked impossibly tired, as if the weight of all his unspoken thoughts, of all the violence he had both witnessed and committed, was pressing down on him. He looked at her, then at the folded shirt in her hands. He didn't ask what she was doing out here in the cold. He knew. She stepped closer, into the small circle of light, and held the shirt out to him. Her hands were trembling. "I mended my dress," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's whole again." He looked from the shirt to her face, his gray eyes searching hers in the flickering light. "We don't need this anymore," she added, her voice catching on the words. The meaning was so much larger than the shirt. It was a declaration, She was no longer the terrified, helpless creature he had found half dead in the grass. She was whole again. 2. She was standing on her own 2 feet, ready to shed the skin of the victim and stand beside him as an equal. He looked down at the shirt, then back at her. A long, silent moment passed between them, a moment in which the entire history of their brief, violent, and tender acquaintance seemed to be held. He was so tired. She could see it in the slump of his shoulders, in the deep-set weariness of his eyes. He carried the weight of the world, and he carried it alone. He reached out, and for a second, she thought he was going to take the shirt, but his hand bypassed the folded cotton and gently, reverently, covered hers. He did not take her hand, he simply rested his own over it, pressing her fingers more firmly into the soft fabric. His hand was large, warm, and calloused, a stark contrast to her own. But what she noticed most, what sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated warmth through her, was that his hand was not trembling at all. It was perfectly, utterly steady. It was an anchor in the shifting tides of her own fear and uncertainty. They stood like that for what felt like an eternity. Their hands joined over the symbolic offering of the shirt, the lantern light flickering at their feet. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they could not say, everything they did not need to say. He had protected her. He had fought for her. He had given her a place to heal. And she, in turn, had brought a measure of light and warmth into his stark, lonely existence. It was a fragile, unspoken bargain that had blossomed into something more. He finally broke the spell, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. He slowly drew his hand back, and this time, he took the shirt from her. He held it for a moment, then set it down carefully on a nearby fence post. He looked at her, and in the quiet, moonlit yard, surrounded by the vast, sleeping plains, a silent understanding passed between them. He did not say he loved her. The words would have been too small, too clumsy for the profound, elemental thing that had grown between them in the silence and the shared hardship. He simply looked into her eyes, and he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. Clara felt the last of her fear melt away, replaced by a quiet, soaring certainty. She nodded back. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was everything. His hand, steady and sure, found hers again. This time without the shirt between them, their fingers intertwined, a perfect fit, and together, they turned and walked back toward the warm, welcoming light of the cabin. The week after the night by the fence was different. The quiet was still there, a constant presence like the sky itself. But its quality had changed. It was no longer a silence of caution or healing, but a silence of deep, settled comfort. It was the quiet of a home. The invisible lines that had separated them had dissolved. Will no longer slept by the hearth. He had moved his bedroll into the main room, but the door to the bedroom where Clara and June slept was never bolted again. In the evenings, they would sit together, not always talking, but simply existing in the same space, the small circle of lamplight, a warm, protective bubble against the vast, dark plains. Will would clean his guns or mend a piece of tack, his large, capable hands moving with a familiar rhythm. Clara and June would sew or read from the one tattered book Will owned, its pages worn soft as cloth. The unspoken language between them grew richer. A shared glance across the table was enough to convey a thought. The way Will placed an extra log on the fire when he saw Clara shiver. The way she made sure his coffee cup was always full. The way June would hum a soft, tuneless song as she worked, these were their conversations, their declarations of care. They were a strange and fractured trinity. A man forged by violence and solitude, a woman reborn from the ashes of her old life, and a girl who was slowly, carefully, learning to trust the world again. They were scarred, all of them. But in the quiet sanctuary of the cabin, their scars were not things to be hidden. They were simply a part of who they were, like the grain in the wood of the cabin walls. One bright, cold afternoon, exactly a week after Will had nodded his silent promise in the moonlight, they saw the rider. He was a stranger, a thin, stooped man on a tired-looking mule, coming from the south. For a tense, heart-stopping moment, the peace of the past week shattered. Clara felt the old, familiar ice creep into her veins, but this was not an aggressor. The man rode slowly, his posture one of weary travel, not menace. He was a circuit mail carrier, one of the lonely human threads that connected the vast, isolated homesteads of the territory. Will went out to meet him, his body relaxed, but his hand resting near the butt of his Colt, a habit as natural as breathing. Clara and June watched from the doorway. The two men spoke for a few minutes, their voices too low to carry. The mail carrier passed over a single, folded piece of paper. Will gave him a coin, and the man touched the brim of his dusty hat before turning his mule around and continuing his slow, solitary journey northward, disappearing back into the emptiness from which he had come. Will stood in the yard for a long time, looking at the folded paper in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. Clara had never seen him look hesitant before. He was a man of immediate, decisive action. This piece of paper, this flimsy link to the outside world, seemed to possess a power that a gun did not. Finally, he walked back to the cabin. He didn't look at either of them. He walked past them to the table, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. He sat down and, with a slow, deliberate movement, unfolded the paper. Clara watched his face. It was, as always, a landscape of shadows and stoic lines. But as he read, she saw a subtle tightening around his jaw, a hardening in his gray eyes that chilled her to the bone. He read the document once, then a second time, his expression unreadable but radiating a cold, still anger that was more frightening than any outburst. June, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, quietly slipped back into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Clara remained, rooted to the spot, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. When he was done reading, Will folded the paper back along its original creases with a strange, meticulous care. He stood up, walked to the hearth where the morning's fire had burned down to a bed of glowing red embers, and he dropped the paper into the heart of the heat. It did not burn immediately. The edges curled, turning brown, then black. Then, with a soft whoosh, it caught fire. The official script, the names, the seals, all of it turned to orange flame and then to delicate, black ash that danced and disintegrated in the heat rising up the chimney. He had not just destroyed a piece of paper. He had erased a verdict, nullified a law. He turned to face her, the last of the flames reflecting in his weary eyes. The finality of his action, the burning of the bridge to the world they had left behind, settled upon Clara with an undeniable weight. She understood, even without having read the words, what that paper had represented. It was the world's claim on her, a legal chain reaching out to drag her back. It was a warrant. She said it was not a question. Will nodded, his gaze steady. From a county sheriff 200 miles south of here, issued on the complaint of a Mr. Jebediah Stone, for a runaway girl, name of Clara, wanted for deserting her place of employment. The words were a grotesque parody of the truth, but they held the power of law, the weight of a world that saw her not as a person, but as a commodity that had been stolen. "They won't stop looking," she whispered, the reality of their situation crashing down on her. They were fugitives. Will was not just a protector. He was now an outlaw, a man harboring a fugitive. This small patch of land was not a home. It was a hideout. A profound sadness washed over her, a grief for a freedom she had only just begun to taste. The world beyond the horizon, a world she had once dreamed of rejoining, was now a map of dangers, a landscape of prisons and courtrooms and men who saw her as property. The gate was closed. "So," she said, her voice small and tight with the realization, "we can't leave." The words hung in the quiet space between them, It was a statement of fact, an acceptance of their new, smaller reality. They were trapped, safe but trapped. Will looked at her, and the hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by something deep and knowing. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them until he was just a breath away. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to hold the space around her. "Or," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that was more gentle than she had ever heard it, "you don't want to—" His words were not a correction. They were a question. They were a gift. He was taking the bars of their cage and reforging them into a choice. He was telling her that the gate was not just something that kept the world out. It was also something that kept them in, together. He was asking her if this cage, this small, isolated world they had built, was enough. He was asking her if he was enough. Clara looked into his tired, gray eyes and saw her own reflection. She saw the girl who had woken up in a crate, the girl who had run barefoot across the plains, the girl who had stood ready with a derringer in her trembling hand. And she saw the woman she was becoming, a woman who had found her strength not in running away, but in staying. She thought of the vast, dangerous world outside, a world of warrants and sheriffs and men who wanted to own her. And then she thought of this small, quiet cabin, of the smell of coffee in the morning, of the groan of the windmill, of June's soft humming, of the steady, comforting presence of the man standing before her. It was not the life she would have dreamed of. It was a life lived in the shadow of a gun, a life confined by the boundaries of a lonely gate. It was not a fairy tale ending, where the princess is rescued and returns to her kingdom. It was something real, something harder, and something infinitely more precious. It was a choice, her choice. A slow smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "No," she whispered, her voice clear and steady. "I don't want to." And so they stayed. The three of them, Will, Clara, and June, lived on in the small log cabin at the heart of the vast, empty plains. Their lives were measured not in days or years, but in the turning of the seasons, in the rhythm of the work, in the quiet moments of shared peace. They were a family forged in fire and blood, their bond stronger than any law, their home a defiant outpost of humanity in a world that had tried to erase them. It was not a perfect life, but it was their life. And sometimes, in a world that gives you nothing, a choice is the only thing you ever really need. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to connect with you. So please comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by many more people.